I want to thank you this morning for the privilege of being able to be here on behalf of the poorest of the poor through the ministry of Food for the Poor. And I want to thank the invitation from Pastor Jefferson and the hospitality and the warmth that's certainly been shown as I have arrived. It's interesting, you know the nickname for this Sunday? This is known as the Low Sunday of the church year. In other words, it has been said that this Sunday is the least attended Sunday of any Sunday during the whole church year. And I'm wondering, is that because we're still kind of wore out from the celebration last week? Maybe we got up early to do the sunrise service, or we have all the family around, and I don't know, if you've got white hair like me, it takes more energy to have family around. And or maybe it's because we know the gospel that's coming up, and we don't want to be reminded of our doubt through Thomas, who's been come to be known as Doubting Thomas. Well, I've got another thought for you this morning. All the disciples were huddled in a locked room for fear. Thomas was out and about for a week. I wonder what he was doing. Was he engaging in other people of this Lord who's no longer in that tomb? Was he raising questions about what Jesus said? And then when the disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord," notice he basically said, "Well, I'd like him to show up. Then I will believe." He wasn't a part of that locked room. He was out and about with his faith, with his doubt. Kind of like us. Food for the poor is not about being in a locked room. Food for the Poor started with two brothers of a successful shipping and import family business in a country known, and I did not know your pastor graduated seminary from that country, Jamaica, until I was here in his office this morning. But these two brothers were raising questions about their faith. And that involves our doubt. That involves our fears. But those words of Jesus, when they have a successful family business, making good profits in a country which also has the poorest of the poor. And this is what was reverberating in their heads as they struggled like a Thomas. Jesus said, if there's somebody that's hungry, you feed them. If there's somebody that's thirsty, you give them something to drink. If somebody is sick, you take care of them. If somebody is a stranger at your door, you welcome them. And if somebody is in prison, you go visit them. So they started to take from their family company profits, turning some bags of rice and starting to distribute them. A little bit longer, they started to build houses. And within 30 years, after putting their hands in the side of Jesus and in his palms, trusting his word, Food for the Poor has become the largest international relief agency located in the United States, and it is a ministry. Because they have learned that it's not just because people are hungry, thirsty, sick, a stranger, or in prison that we are to do something. They have discovered, like Thomas, that when you put your hands there, with the least, Jesus says, you put your hands in me. So, Pastor, my first trip to Jamaica was on a cruise ship, which I would imagine if anybody else has been to Jamaica, that's how you experienced it as well. I can still remember, I haven't, now that we're able, since my wife and I have retired, to go on cruises, we've only been on about 5 in our lifetime. And maybe that's 5 more than many of you. But I remember going to Jamaica. Because of those 5 cruises, it's the only time I heard a cruise director, as we approached Jamaica, say over the loudspeaker, "Now go out and have a good time. You will discover some lovely people on this island." But a word of caution, first time I ever heard that from a cruise director. Don't go to Kingston. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Kingston being the capital, being in the center of Jamaica. But I also thought it was kind of odd that when we docked and all the local people had their vendors set up on the wharf, and many of them spoke English, and as we engaged in conversation, you know, the happiness that's shown in the basic wares they were selling. But several of them said, "Enjoy our country, but watch out for Kingston." I have never forgotten that. Especially when Food for the Poor wants to make sure we as speakers know what we're talking about up here. So every 2 years we have the opportunity to go on a mission pilgrimage to one of the 17 countries in the Caribbean and Latin America. And one of those pilgrimages was to Jamaica. And guess where we went? Kingston. Right off the bat. We experienced what Food for the Poor was doing there in terms of feeding the hungry, developing housing projects, entering into husbandry, animal husbandry, planting of fruit trees, to enable people to have the dignity of having work amidst and among the poorest of the poor. So you can imagine my anxiousness as we flew into Jamaica and then got on the little caravan bus and went to Kingston. But that fear and anxiousness rose another degree when we were told that we were going to the central prison of Jamaica, located in Kingston. I will never forget that van going through 3 steel gates, clanging shut behind us. And we empty out into this prison yard where all the inmates were gathered. But we were on our way to the chapel service that day, led by the chaplain. There were over 200 inmates who had gathered for that service. It was a beautiful service. We as speakers were sitting there. We were taking it in. We had the opportunity before the service to talk to many of, this was a male prison, to many of them, to hear their story. But then as we got to the end of the service, the chaplain called 7 young men forward. Because in the prison system of Central America and the Caribbean, it's the old penal system. In other words, if you do a small non-violent crime, you need to pay a fine or go to prison. So if you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family and get caught, you go to prison. And you stay there until you can pay your fine. Well, if you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, how in the world are you going to pay a fine to get out of prison? So these 7 young men were called forward because the chaplain said that day, in honor of these speakers who are gathered here, you are free to go home. Their minor fine had been paid by the generous and compassionate giving of people who have partnered with Food for the Poor. I will not forget the tears of all 7 of those young men as they greeted us after the service and wanted to make sure that they knew they were going to make the best use of their second life outside of the prison. It's a program that Food for the Poor entered into because of the words of Jesus. And it's a program that they have realized the tremendous benefit that goes back into the community of these nonviolent offenders. And they do it every Christmas and every Easter. And here's the email I got on Wednesday. Norius, age 31, a husband and father of 7, who in Haiti said this, quote, "The bananas were on my side of the fence of my home, so I decided to take a few to feed my children. Unfortunately, the owner was not very happy about that and called the police, and I got arrested. So I had to leave my children at home with their mother, who had difficulty providing for the family alone. Noria served more than 2 years at Port de Paix prison for lack of money to pay his fine. Or Phineas, age 52, spent nearly 7 years in Fort Liberté prison, where he stole food to feed his wife and 2 children. He admitted that what he did was wrong, but he said he was desperate. Quote, "Everyone knows how hard it is to watch your kids suffering for hunger. So I decided to rob a shop, and I took 2 bags of rice to feed my children, and the police caught me." He said, "I admit what I did was wrong, but my children were more important." Or Jose in Honduras, age 41, who was abandoned by his parents and grew up a vagabond as a young man, whom he moved to Guatemala in search for a better life, where he met his wife. They never had any children. And after 9 years, she died. He returned to Honduras and later learned that he was HIV positive. He became depressed. He started drinking and stealing basic island items. He was soon arrested and sent to prison. While there, he learned to make furniture. After 2 years, he learned that he was being released for Easter. Quote, "I feel very grateful to God, to Food for the Poor, for recovering my freedom and helping me to return to society." One of the men released from Tower Street in Jamaica is a 23-year-old construction worker. He said while working at the supermarket, his cell phone fell and the screen broke. A coworker loaned him a cell phone until the one that he had was repaired. He didn't know it, but the loaner phone was stolen. He was arrested and fined $390 US, or 50,000 Jamaican dollars. Now hear this. The inmate's father was willing to pay the fine for his release, but the young man refused. Since his father is the main provider for the family, he felt that the needs of his younger siblings and his love for them outweighed his own situation. He said, I quote, "I decided I would just do the same so that money could go towards their education," or "I decided I would just do the time so that money could go towards their education, as one will be starting college soon and the other is about to complete secondary school. My siblings are the pride and joy of the family, so I wanted to make sure that they are okay." You are the first congregation or parish where I have focused on Jesus' words regarding those in prison. Normally I talk about the hunger programs that feed more than 1 million people a year or a day, or the houses that are being built, or as I mentioned, the animal husbandry, food trees, the medicine that is there for children in orphanages, one that's designated entirely to an HIV children. And now the unique problem, if you want to call it, is that those children who were brought as infants are now 18, 20 years old, and they are thriving because of the medicine that has been given to them through the supervision of nurses as well as angels that take care of them. And now the greatest challenge that they have is the discrimination in the community against HIV. So what Food for the Poor is doing about that is now providing halfway houses so that the community can experience the talents and the gifts of these young men and women and be able to accept them into the community. I'm hoping that you get a glimpse of touching the wounds of Jesus when he says, when you do it to the least, you do it to me. And that my role here today is to connect us who have been blessed and continue to be blessed and do not have locked doors, but that we are able to freely walk and talk and share. This brochure lets you know ways that you can touch those who are the least, the poorest of the poor. To support a child in an orphanage, $34 a month. Or maybe United Methodist Congregation here in Fulton would adopt a project to build a house, first-time shelter for a family. Whatever it is, this becomes an offering envelope. Place your gift in the envelope. You may give it to me personally because I want to thank you personally. You may choose to send it in after you look at the website on Food for the Poor and verify the things that I've said, and this I have not said, that of every dollar you give, more than 95 cents gets into the hands of the people that need it for their life and sustenance. This first Sunday following the resurrection of our Lord is one to celebrate. It's one to go out those doors and to trust the words of our risen Christ, that whenever we do it for the least among us, we do it for him.